So one of the things that I was really thinking about a lot lately is this idea that Bateson gives us that you can't look at one half of a relationship and make sense. What you're going to make is disaster. And this I find, man, it's just so important. It comes up all the time when I'm working with clients, working with patients. It's a big problem in a lot of the helping professions where we tend to actually take on a lot of the burden of what's up for us, our problems, our challenges. We make it very focused on the individual. And I find that it's fairly difficult for people to zoom out and take into account the context in which these problems arise. And that, I think, is the thing that Bateson's really getting at with this idea, that if we just look at what's going on with the person and we fail to take into account the broader context currently and maybe the historical context in which these behaviors developed, then we're really doing ourselves a disservice. We're just not going to be very effective. So what do we make of that? We've got this coupling of organism and environment as the only reasonable unit of analysis. We can't just look at what's going on with the individual, and we can't just look at what's going on in the context, but we have to see how do these two latch together in a way such that I can take a look at what the organism is doing, and I can take a look at the environmental conditions it's relating to. And based on that, I can get a much more rigorous understanding of how this system goes. One of the things we have to keep in mind is that the system is perfectly calibrated for the results that it's creating. And so if we are not satisfied with the kind of results, we can take a look. Do we change what the organism is doing, or do we change the environment in which that organism is situated? And go figure, sometimes we have more or less ability to tinker with these things. On a local level, we have a huge ability to influence our own behavior, and to a degree, some of the environments that we find ourselves in. If we zoom way out, it's like, well, maybe there's not a whole lot we can do to change the global environment. And that's where, again, our behavior becomes very important to adjust. But with that in mind, we could take a look then at this idea of regulation of the organism and the environment. Because what we are constantly attempting to do is regulate ourselves. We're trying to find the fit between what we want and need and what the environment makes available. And depending on how flexible we can be with how we act within that environment, we're able to take advantage of more and more of what the environment provides. Whereas if we're fairly rigid, if we're fairly inflexible, we're not going to have a very easy time actually taking advantage of what the environment offers us. So this is where we get into this concept then of an affordance, which is basically the environment saying, here is an option for a behavior. You can make use of it if you'd like. The easiest way to understand this is that the stool that I'm sitting on affords me a sitting place. The floor affords me supportive surfaces across which I could locomote. The cup here, unfortunately, is empty, but it affords me gripability and maybe holdability of some liquid, ideally coffee. I'm going to need a little more later on. But for now, we can see that if I'm able to make use of these opportunities for engagement with the environment, not only does it connect me to the lived world a little more deeply, but I'm also able to get a bit more of what I want out of life. If I want a drink of coffee, I've got to know how to manipulate my environment in such a way that I can get a drink of coffee. And that's a trivial example, right? But if I want to get up and down from the ground pain-free, if I want to start and grow and scale a business, I've got to know how to regulate myself in the environment in particular ways. Each of these things is going to depend on certain affordances and my ability to make use of those affordances. Now, why is this such a big deal? Moshe Feldenkrais, one of the pioneers of somatic education, has this beautiful line at the start of one of his books where he says, we act in accordance with our self-image, which is to say that I think of myself as a certain sort of person living in a certain sort of world. And based on that self-image, there are certain actions I'm likely to engage in and certain actions I am likely not to engage in. So I would imagine none of us here have robbed a bank within the last week. No matter what bills are coming up, it's like, that's not the sort of person that I am. Maybe, I don't know. We get up to different things at different times in our lives. But there are certain things that we have engaged in, certain activities. And those are things that fit within our self-image. Now, the question of self-image is an interesting one. And this gets us into this idea of how we might get stuck from time to time. Because our self-image, we might think, is kind of the mix of my neuromuscular view of myself, how able I am to engage in the environment. Like, I know that a hand is a part of my self-image, and that there are functions a hand can perform. It can pick this up, it can write on something. That's an aspect of my self-image. In addition, there is a kind of historically informed narrative. Again, the sort of person that I am, which is usually described in terms of a handful of adjectives. I'm an outgoing sort of person. I'm a shy sort of person. I'm a confident sort of person. I'm a no fluff, no BS sort of person. I'm whatever. And while we might think that these adjectives are fixed attributes of who we are, they're actually a little more like categories of behavior. So a confident sort of person is a character, essentially. It's comprised of all sorts of little actions within this overarching category. And all these actions are, of course, in relation to some environment. Nobody is just confident in a vacuum, right? Nobody is shy in a vacuum. These are always in relation to some perceived environment. Now, these characters that we develop, or this sort of person that we seem to be, that puts together our self-image, it's developed in relation to historical experience. And what many of us fail to take into account is that the sort of person we are is in large part reactive, which is to say that most of us, especially when we find a kind of rigid character, we're attempting not to be a particular thing that our historical circumstances led us to think was bad, safe, compromising to our attachments. I should say unsafe, not safe. But I think we get it. So in my case, one of the things that made this clearest to me, my family of origin, you can't be dumb. You just can't be dumb. It's a family of teachers. It's a family of very intelligent people. We're very thinky sorts of people. And so if I wanted to get attention, affection, praise, it's like, well, you can't be dumb. So what's the safest bet then? We just look at the opposite. You be smart. You be a smart person. And then you hedge your bets against being seen as dumb. And so we can see other examples of this too. Someone who's shy, for instance, is often attempting not to be visible, seen, witnessed, because maybe family of origin indicated that if you were loud and outgoing, if you were rambunctious, if you were too confident, you just get cut off at the knees. And so we learn early on that there is a certain sort of person that prevents these bad things from happening. And we adopt that as a particular identity. As we grow and develop, if we fail to take into account the way that our environment is changing, our social environment, our tangible material environment, we may miss out on obvious cues that say this sort of person, at the very least, is no longer necessary, but maybe it's not even worthwhile. Maybe it's maladaptive given how our circumstances have changed. And so if we continue to relate to the world here and now, as we maybe compulsively did there and then, we're engaged in a maladaptive process. We no longer fit the demands of the world. And so we might find that the world seems to be just out of control. We can't make progress toward our goals. Our relationships aren't as satisfying as we might like. And so then there's this question, well, how do we adjust this character? How do we start to become a different sort of person? And there are a couple of ways that we might look at this. And one is we might substitute out one sort of person for another. It's like, well, I'm not going to be a shy person. I'm going to be an outgoing person now. And maybe that's better, but we can see that also sets us up for a trap, because if that character becomes more rigid, then we might miss out on other opportunities to adapt ourselves. So I think the more adaptive thing long-term, what's going to do us the most good across the broadest set of domains, is to divest from that character altogether. To do our best to ensure that our sense of security is not contingent upon the enactment of that character. So how do we do that? This is where this mind-body connection becomes very important. And I think Bateson gives another clue in another one of his essays when he describes these categories of learning and behavior. And he's got learning levels, let's say, of 0 and 1 and 2 and 3. And what he describes as learning 3 is effectively a divestment from historical character. And he describes that it's not without risks, that some people who attempt to go into this process, they become psychotic. And if you're at all familiar with some of my recent story, the time I lost my mind, I think is pretty good evidence. It's like, I had a big question then. As I pick apart this character, I have to figure out, well, who the hell am I at this point? And oh my God, if this isn't what I was, then it becomes very disorienting. But he says that some people are protected, let's say. They buffer against the really worst case scenarios of going crazy. They're buffered by establishing concrete relations with the environment through their embodiment. And he describes that these are the sort of incorruptible innocence of the world. They eat when they're hungry. They sleep when they're tired. These are the people who, when they hear their favorite jam come on in the club, they don't care who's watching. They're just moving around. They're like possessed by the music. They don't care how goofy they look. They're just having a good time. They're feeling what they feel at that point. And so I think that this really does offer us a clue. If we want to pick apart the character, the question is, who are we? What are we? Underneath all of the grime of socialization, if we stopped filtering ourselves through what we think the other person thinks about us, or through what we expect as a result of their expectations, what are we left with? And I think at the base level, what we're left with is what we sense and what we feel moment to moment. So the question, I think, then is, if I'm thirsty, can I just get a drink of water? Or if I'm hungry and I'm craving, I don't know, I'm craving sag paneer, do I have to go through the whole rigmarole of, well, what do you want for dinner? I don't know. What do you think we should have for dinner? I don't know. What do you? I say, I'm hungry. I want some sag paneer. Let's order this. Or if I'm tired, do I have to do the whole Midwestern goodbye and say, well, yes, I ought to be getting on the road? Or can I just say, I'm tired. I'm going to go now. And maybe it comes across as blunt sometimes, but there's also a way that when we see people who are really connected to their embodied experience and they just go with it, it's like, they're so confident. They're just living their life. They show up when they want to party. They go home when they're tired. They eat when they're hungry. They drink when they're thirsty. So I'm going to suggest that one of the ways we can really begin to divest from this character, from this social crust we put together, is by really connecting with our moment-to-moment bodily experience. One of the ways, and I think everybody here watching this is going to be familiar with this, is we can check in with 3 questions. How are you? How do you know how you are? And what does that ask of you? What could you do to meet that need? So if I'm thirsty and my mouth is dry, I could take a drink of water. If I'm tired, my eyelids are heavy and I'm slumping over, I could take a nap. I could go to bed. I could hit pause on whatever this activity is. And at the very least, go change my activity. So I'm going to recommend that as a starting point. But then I also want to take it a bit further, because Bateson suggests that when we get to this level of learning 3, not only are we deeply embodied, but we also have access, if we're a little more creative, a little more open, we have access to what we could describe as a mystical experience, where there's a kind of oneness. There's this ability to connect to this beautiful unity of being. And man, I think if you've tasted the infinite once, there's very little more important than figuring out how to help other people do that too. It's like, by God, if we can experience this deep connection, why aren't we driving at that? So he cites William Blake and the stanza about seeing eternity in a grain of sand and heaven in a wild flower. And what I will suggest as a possibility, at least, is that if we can get into this feedback loop process of how am I, how do I know, what does this ask of me, it starts to practice our ability to be given over to the phenomena that we encounter in the world. It's like this beautiful ray of sunlight that comes through at like 10:30 in the morning most days, and it just glimmers off of the dew on the trees. How can I be claimed by the beauty of that experience? Because if I can immerse myself in what I perceive in any given moment, if I can be so given over to the phenomena that I encounter, that I think makes available something like a mystical experience. And there's this other guy, Arthur, I believe it's Deichmann, Deikman is the guy's last name. He wrote this book, Meditations on a Blue Vase. And he attempted what he described as a functional mysticism. How do you create conditions where people can just experience mystical experience? So he would have them meditate on a blue vase, or maybe now we'll meditate on a white mug. And he would have them just sit and contemplate this thing and attempt not to think anything about it, not to analyze it, not to do any of this, but just to be with the perception, to be with the phenomenon as it's experienced. And in his case reports, people describe the thing blurring and changing size. They describe it filling up the room. They describe weird psychological phenomena that occur when they're simply with their perception without attempting to change anything about it. So what I would suggest then is that we've got this available to us everywhere and always. If there is an infinite, it's everywhere and it's always. And so the question then is, can I be with the sculpture on my desk? Can I be with the person that I'm talking to? Can I be with the angle of the sunlight in such a way that I can experience myself as a part of the broader whole? Not Chandler as the smart guy, not Chandler as the, I don't know, the shy guy, not Chandler as the this, that, or the other, Chandler as given over to what is perceived in that particular moment. And so again, I think that a big part of this really comes down to our ability to ask how we are, to get a sense of how we are situated in relation to those phenomena, to get a sense of how we know that, what's endogenous, what's available only to us as a perception that lets us know how we are. And then based on that, what does this ask of me? What does this mug ask of me? What does this impromptu workshop ask of me? What does this woodpecker flitting about on the tree, hopping around doing his thing ask of me? What can I do to be with this a little more deliberately, a little more openly? And that, I think, is how we can begin to divest from our historical character and find ourselves anew moment to moment. That, I think, is what really an adaptive identity is about, is how can I experience myself as secure and as whole with this or with that or with this or with that, so I can make myself moment to moment and movement to movement by being not separate from, not identifying myself as bounded by the skin, but beginning to identify myself as in the relationship between me, whatever I am, and that, whatever that is.